us Lisa Bloom from Northwestern Medicine Behavioral Health. She practices out of Central DuPage Hospital and Del Norte Hospital. Lisa has a master's of social work from Loyola University, go Ramblers, and she has been involved in the issues of addiction, mental health, and trauma since 2004. And I can tell you that Lisa in Northwestern Medicine Behavioral Health has already prevented one nervous breakdown from occurring, and that's me. Because late last week I found out that the person that I had scheduled to do this presentation backed out, and so on Wednesday I was scrambling around trying to find somebody to fill the gap. So Lisa graciously agreed to fill the gap and prevented me from going completely out of my mind. So thank you for being here.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, David. I'm honored to be here today. It's a subject matter that's near and dear to my heart. If by chance my voice starts to kind of fade, it sometimes can do that, please just do this or come down and pull my arm. I know we have just an hour. I know we're bumping up against lunch. I know you're probably tired. It's a Monday. It was a hard, snowy weekend. So what I'm hoping to do is talk for about 45, 50 minutes and then leave the remaining time for questions. Let's see if I can get this. All right. So who here is even familiar with the term compassion fatigue? Wow. All right, that's awesome. When David introduced me and said that we're here to really talk about addiction and mental health, that was the truth. But addiction and mental health is really a symptom of a continuum of stress, a continuum of burnout, and ultimately a place or a space we may find ourselves that's called compassion fatigue. So I really have three goals today. First and foremost is to get you aware of signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue and burnout and stress, because we kind of want to intervene before we reach further along the continuum. But probably as important, for you to maybe be able to look to your left, to look to your right, and see it in a colleague, a friend, a family member who might be struggling. You never know when you're going to pull someone from the ledge. Secondly, I know how busy your jobs are. Admittedly, I'm a social worker, so sort of the shoes I stand in, and no matter how much I try to empathize, I can't. So what I hope to do, though, is at least get you to tune into yourself and try to think about maybe where you're struggling and what you can do about it, and then maybe what obstacles are possibly in the way. I'm going to open with just a very non-scientific statistic, but quite close. 1 in 10 people have an addiction problem. That means they have a substance use disorder that's been diagnosed. That means if there are 100 people in this room, 10 of you are struggling with drugs or alcohol. And that doesn't even take into account those who might be struggling with a substance misuse, haven't presented to treatment, and maybe are what we call functioning. So it's here, it's a problem. But the really important question really isn't whether or not you have an addiction. It's really not why the addiction, why the pain? And that's really what we're here to talk about. All right, so here's a little bit of the social worky that's going to come out. Break it up a bit. So what I'd like to do is a brief, and I do mean brief, mindfulness exercise. It's really just to kind of get you to tune into what's going on inside. So for those of you who have maybe papers in your hand, if you can put them aside. I know that might be hard, or a phone. Put them aside. Those in the back, I know I can't see you. I know there was a gentleman reading a newspaper, which is rare these days, so I appreciate that. If you don't have both feet on the ground, if you can, and if you're comfortable, and I know there's a lot of issues with back, try to get your feet flat on the floor. All right? If we can dim the lights, that would be ideal, but I'm new here, so I don't want to ask for too much. All right, so try to, if it's comfortable, close your eyes. Only if it's comfortable. Just maybe close your eyes. You can keep them open if you want. This is all about you and where you're comfortable. Just start to notice what you're feeling inside, it's quite possible that you might not be feeling anything. And give yourself permission to feel that. Maybe your mind is wandering, you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, you're thinking about all the work you left undone last week and it's Monday. You're thinking about maybe a sick child or an aging parent, but try to just come back to the present moment here and turn your thoughts inward to how you're feeling, what you're feeling. Maybe more specifically, where in your body you're feeling some sort of tension. Maybe it's a growling stomach. And remember, if you can't feel anything, if this is challenging for you, that's all right. If you're comfortable, we're going to start by focusing on our breath. So let's do that together. Take a breath in and let it out. Let's try that one more time. Inhale, and slowly exhale. Just try to notice the rhythm of your breathing as you breathe in naturally and you breathe out. Maybe you can't even feel your breathing. Maybe it's something that's really uncomfortable and unnatural for you, and that's okay. Just notice what this experience is like for you. Now maybe we're going to move down to our feet. See if you can feel your feet touching the floor. That's comfortable. Maybe you can wiggle your toes and see what that's like. If your hands are seated on your lap, maybe tap your fingers. If they're held together, tap each finger, see what that's like. See if you can focus all your energy to that activity of just moving your fingers. We're going to take one more breath in. Inhale and exhale. Remember, we're not trying to get anywhere. We're just trying to get curious about where we're at. When you're ready, for those of you who have your eyes closed, please open them. Who found that enjoyable? Awesome. Who found that really, really unpleasant? Like, I just can't stand it when people ask me to sit still and stay calm. And then one last question here. Who has a regular meditation practice? Awesome. That's great to hear. Or even mindful movement. Yoga, that's meditation. All right. Who here can't stand it? You really are waiting for this part of this presentation to get over with. All right. That's good, and that's fair. That's our starting point. All right. Let's move forward. One last exercise. I'm going to read 6 questions, and as I go through them, please just answer them in your own mind, and don't give it too much thought. Just what comes to mind. And remember, one last qualifier. These can be mood dependent, and that's understandable. We have different moods, but try to think what comes generally to your mind. The world is a blank place. Life is, I am, as a human being, I want to change about my job, I want to change about myself. Last question, most often I feel all right, file those away. We're going to come back to those. All right, let's unpack compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is the cumulative physical, emotional, psychological effects of continual exposure to traumatic or distressing stories, events when working in a helping profession. Everyone in this room, including myself, is in a helping profession. Everyone in this room hears repeated stories of struggle, suffering, and humanity. Do you think that's about 100%, 95% accurate? Yeah. So all of us have the propensity to experience compassion fatigue. But compassion fatigue exists on a continuum. And we know that stress is a good thing. Stress is what got us out of bed this morning because it's Monday and we have to get our stuff done. Stress is what got me up here in front of this podium at the last minute. It took 5 days and I'm glad to do it. But it's what gets the adrenaline going. It gets us up and going and it gets us in gear. But too much stress, and we all know that, and we all know the physical health ramifications of stress, that there's a tipping point, and when you have too much of it, adverse events and consequences occur. And again, it's a continuum. So stress is good, burnout, and we're going to a little later talk about the differentiator really between burnout and compassion fatigue. And the idea is to recognize where you might exist along the continuum soon, so that you don't go forward and you don't incur greater consequences, not just for your own health, but also those of the people around you. Trauma beliefs. What do we see here? We see images that we're very familiar with. First thing that comes to mind is, because of my line of work, is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a trauma response. Compassion fatigue is trauma. Dina earlier talked about other types of trauma: sexual assault, sexual harassment, war, rape. Those are things that in a society we're very accustomed to understanding and looking through as trauma, through the trauma lens. It's important to know that, like I started out, what you all folks experience in this room is traumatic. And remember, the issue here isn't the event, it's not the story, it's not being a veteran, it's not experiencing rape. Those events are traumatic. The trauma is what is left in the body and what we're left to deal with and how it impacts our nervous system and how that then bleeds into all areas of our life. That's the trauma, that's the pain. These are images that I'm sure are familiar in your line of work. But the other piece, and we've heard about it, I've heard the word adversarial here today quite a few times, but the other is the insidious and invisible. And trauma is something that is external, meaning that it's caused by external events, but trauma also has the invisible, insidious elements to it. And those, quite frankly, sometimes can be the most difficult to really deal with because we don't get the support that we really need. So the idea that we work in an environment where there's one winner and there's one loser, we're interested in wanting to fix. We know that our job is to solve problems, and yet we have a sense of powerlessness and helplessness to do that. We don't accept sometimes that it's just not humanly possible. And I think most important, many of us, including myself, we go into a line of work where we think we're going to make a difference, we think there's going to be principles and ethics and things like integrity and justice that are going to align with our own personal values. And I don't think I need to tell this group, but sadly we find that that's not always the case. And so you kind of walk around with this cloud on your head, and it's largely why I had you answer those questions when we started, to know where you're feeling in terms of who you are in the world. So that gets me to really what is the differentiator between burnout and compassion fatigue. We can understand burnout as really just extending ourselves beyond our physical and mental capabilities. And sometimes just a great long vacation can really help that. But the differentiator between burnout and compassion fatigue is really the impact on the sense of self and our worldview. We don't feel good about ourselves and we don't feel good about the world we live in. The loss of caring and empathy is really the hallmark. What enters into the equation instead of the desire and need to really care is a sense of apathy. And apathy can show up as isolation, it can show up as numbing. It certainly makes it much more able to think about using substances in a way that's harmful. We really just want to escape. And really, the heart and demeanor is really important as well. It's the idea that the fundamental beliefs that brought us to this work, that wants us to do well for our clients, well as a father or a mother, a sister. They're just really shattered, and there's really just no purpose or meaning anymore. And lastly, a disconnection from self and others. We just really don't know who we are in our bodies anymore and how to relate to others in the world in a way that's comfortable. So this is a great way to really look among the dimensions and see where you might recognize yourself in terms of where you might be struggling, or a loved one, or a colleague. I want to first and foremost point out the physical. The reason why I had to do that mindfulness exercise is because, as you may know in terms of trauma, who here is familiar with the flight, fight, freeze, triad? Yeah. So that's a normal adaptive response. Our bodies, through evolution, were developed to deal with threat and danger. But they're supposed to deal with the threat and danger and then be released from it. The issue with trauma is that the body keeps the score. The trauma is actually held in the body, it's not released. And in order to help that release, you really have to gain awareness of what those sensations are in the body. So as uncomfortable it is, and that's really a good sign, to sit here and be uncomfortable to actually feel in your body is really important. And if the answer today is I really can't feel anything, that's a good place to start. You might recognize depression and anxiety. Trauma or compassion fatigue is a great, depression and anxiety is a great imitator of compassion fatigue. So when you're using words like I'm feeling deadened and stifled and low energy, or I'm hyper aroused, I have a lot of rumination. Who here has thoughts that ruminate? Excessive worry? Of course, sometimes we just have to deal with we're intellectual people, we're heavy in the cognitive realm, but when it gets to a point where it's overtaking you, it's consuming you, that's when you start looking at other clusters of symptoms and really what symptomology we're looking at. Before we get to some strategies and talk about really what the cornerstone of protecting ourselves, let yourself off the hook. Compassion fatigue in the world that we live in and the demands that we have is understandable. Self-compassion and getting curious about who we are and understanding, letting ourselves be human is really, really pivotal and making any headway to take better care of ourselves. The other point I really want to make is this talk today isn't about overlooking or minimizing anything that you might be experiencing as far as high demands, high caseload, high stress. Those things are real, and it's not to walk away with any sense that those aren't significant. But it is about learning how we can better take care of ourselves, which we do have control over. So what is resilience? Resilience is really, I like to interchange with mindfulness and awareness. It can be developed. It allows us to be present with our feelings and present with others. And elements of resilience, this is where I ask you to take your hand out, all of you. So our brain is plastic, and Dr. Dan Siegel, anyone here familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's work? He writes does great work with parenting, but he also does a great little hand thing. It's actually for kids, so you can do it with your kids. But if you do this is your brain. And why do we want resilience? We want resilience because our brain, I'll hold my mic. We have the brainstem, which is responsible for breathing, automatic functions. We have the amygdala. The amygdala, who here has heard the word amygdala? It's huge in the research right now. Thank you. I know we got some folks in here who know the trauma and mindfulness research. Amygdala is our alarm bell. It's our smoke detector. It's what's on watch, detecting an environment where there's a threat. And people who experience further along the continuum of compassion fatigue are uncomfortable in their skin. They're always on guard. They have a feeling in their gut that things aren't right. And they're hypersensitive to the environment. So that's the thing that informs first. And then you have this. Anyone want to take a guess at what this is? It's what you're using all the time. Who? I hear something.
Cortex.
What's that?
Cortex.
Cortex? Thank you. What is your name? Your name's Carol? Thank you. That's exactly right. Cortex. So the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is responsible for all of our executive functioning. It's responsible for the gentleman here reading his paper. It's responsible for the work you're doing right now as I'm talking. It's all of the rational reasoning, impulse control, although that might not be impulse control, that we do and we need all day long. So what happens in the trauma response is that we flip our lid. Doop. And flipping your lid isn't just getting angry and isn't just raging. It's also just numbing, spacing out, what we call in my world disassociating. We're just disconnecting from our amygdala is feeling there's some threat in the environment, and our rational part of our brain is being hijacked. It's called the amygdala hijacked. And we no longer have this integration, so we behave in ways that we normally wouldn't want to behave in. That's the trauma response. What resilience does is create the glue so that you have connection between the amygdala and the cortex, so that we can practice what you probably have heard, the pause, and you can feel the adrenaline, the cortisol, and you can stop and you can say, before flipping your lid. So that's the science behind resilience. But it's simple, and we heard earlier in a talk, simple is good. We like simple. Who doesn't like simple? But simple isn't easy, so it's practice. So why I had you sit here for the first few minutes was to see, where are you? Are you comfortable with getting in your body and figuring out what's there? Because resilience and awareness is all about noticing what's going on, noticing what's in your body, noticing what's in your thoughts, your emotions, gut feeling. You know the expression, I feel it in my gut? We have words for these things. We have words to describe the sensation in our body. I'm not comfortable in my skin. I feel it in my bones. I feel it in my gut. That's important information. The more we get in tune with that, the more we develop awareness and resilience to protect ourselves from the stresses of the day. So strategies to promote well-being. Know and honor your limits. Set boundaries. Allow yourself to be human. Be an empathic witness. Do you have a self-care plan? And what does that mean to you? Are you breathing? And practice self-compassion. Fun is a pretty kind of pedestrian topic, but it's an important one. When we're talking about keeping ourselves protected from compassion fatigue and burnout, we're really talking about a work-life balance, which might be incredibly impossible. We like to think that it'd be incredibly impossible. I often hear, well, I don't have time to do yoga, I don't have time for meditation. My go-to answer is, well, you have time for what's important, but I don't think that's realistic. If you have a good friend, a loved one, an appropriate mammal, someone you feel safe and trust, ask them, to seriously take a look at your life where you might have more time for fun, for things that are relaxed wakefulness. This might be someone's idea of fun. This might be someone else's idea of fun. Introversion and extroversion are really important. The idea is to figure out what is fun and to create a healthy platter, which includes all dimensions of our lives, our work, our connections to people, our exercise, our nutrition, and so forth. Are you in a healthy zone? Who here is in a healthy zone? Awesome. And lastly, and I really flew through this, that's outstanding. We have time for lots of questions, and I'd like to read you something. So take care of yourself. And the importance of that is really being able to take care of yourself so that you can be an empathic witness to someone else's pain and struggle. You never know when you're going to pull someone from the ledge. Questions? You guys might get to leave early. Yeah.
Say to your boss, I need a little
Yeah, I have to admit, sitting here, hearing a couple other talks, I mean, it's a different culture. It is a different culture. The hours, the demands, I think that Dina actually, you have to go against the status quo. Some people have more at stake, and therefore they're more afraid. But you got to take the leap. If there's something that you believe in, and I'll tell you, I'll give you a little background on how I got into this. A couple years ago, I had three really big stressors within a year. I had some health problems. I was experiencing grief and loss. My father died, and I had lost my job. And I realized at that point that I wasn't relating to myself or to others in a way that was working for me. And at that point, I had been practicing yoga for 10, 15 years, and I realized I hadn't been practicing yoga at all. I had been going through poses. I was recovering. For years, I'd been recovering. I was a long-distance runner. And it was at that point where I really started to stop and breathe. I realized I hadn't been breathing in yoga for 10 years. And then something miraculous happened, and I know, miracles do happen every day, but I remember the very first time I felt my feet. I was walking down the street. I remember I was on Broadway up in Wrigleyville or in Boys Town, and I remember my feet on the ground and feeling my feet on my ground. And it was the first time that I really saw the benefit of the mindfulness part of the movement of yoga and was able to integrate that and take better care of myself. So this stuff isn't hooey. So to get to your question, David, there's a lot of, there are materials or books, there are resources. Lawyer's Assistance Program is a great resource to steer yourself or people in. People want to take care of you, they want you well. But I think, if I understand you, the question is really how do we get the powers to be to really buy into what's really important to what it is to be human and to be productive. And I don't know if we're there yet, and I kind of think that Dina, the question back there was an important one, which is, do you think we have to kind of go through the mores, flush things out? It's going to get worse before it gets better. I sure the hell hope not. We're in an opioid epidemic right now. Mental health, particularly amongst young people, is on the rise. We don't have any more time to waste. Mindfulness is critical. Being aware of ourselves. Everything I talked about today bleeds. We're here to talk about how to avoid indiscretions at work, but those indiscretions are bleeding into all areas of our lives, and we have spouses, significant others, loved ones, pets at home that really need our attention. Is there a question? Yes, ma'am.
This is a little bit more towards petitioner side attorneys who deal with, the clients and the work with them. The adage is that, the client that calls you 12 times a day is the one who's probably not really all that hurt. They're the ones who just sort of get consumed. We have clients who get so consumed with their cases and they don't, either through lack of health insurance or whatever, their attorney ends up, they think they're their therapist, their social worker, their confidant, their, whatever it may end up being. Do you have any sort of helpful tips to sort of be able to handle that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not your therapist,
yeah.
The second time you called today, sort of the ability to be able to sort of handle that while also keeping care with our own mental health.
No, that's beautiful. I want to hear the question. You have demands and you have demanding clients, and how do you keep your wits about you, right? And how do you, so you're talking about boundaries, if I'm hearing correctly. You're also talking about maybe having somewhat of a responsibility, say, to steer them to a place where they can get help. You're also talking about a sense of helplessness, what is mine in my realm of work and what belongs outside of it. I think what I'm hearing from you is you have a lot of knowledge that it's hitting you in a place where this isn't necessarily should be on my plate. I'm not a therapist, right? One thing I've always really admired about attorneys is how versed they are in so many different subject matters, and including mental health in terms of, hey, recognizing this isn't what I do, but I think I can tell you who can. So there's a start, asking some questions. so that's that piece of being a consultant to them. But the other is, what I'm hearing is not reacting. And a lot of the mindfulness, and I was a little timid to do that exercise with you, simply because it's a little different to do, and you know, the presentations that you typically have don't include it. But then, you know, I realized that exercise, that way of being, and if you look at the picture on the, let's see, him, you can be mindful without putting your fingers up and sitting in a lotus pose. You know, to not be reactive is really just a choice you make because you develop some resiliency, your brain, which is neuroplastic, can rewire, and so you feel yourself able to restrain yourself when you might feel more reactive. That's something that I've really seen improvement in me. So that's why mindfulness is really important, and it's a practice. There are going to be days where you do flip your lid, and you just have to accept that you're human. And that's probably one of the most important things I'd like you to take away. This isn't about perfection, it's about a practice to get yourself into a more comfortable place, but most importantly to be in an uncomfortable place and be okay with it. Yes, sir?
We're all breathing. What do you mean by breathing?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you brought that up. I hate breathing. I think that like I said, for years I didn't breathe. Breathing is really hard. Breathing, when I did the inhale, exhale, I felt a little lightheaded. Who felt lightheaded with the breathing? It's not easy, and you are all breathing. The reason why I had you move your feet a little bit and move your fingers is because there's lots of ways to build inner awareness. And it doesn't just have to be with the breath. And if there's any advanced yoga practitioner in here, they might be really upset with hearing me say that. But really all we're trying to do with that mindfulness is develop awareness of what's going on inside. So if that means that tapping your finger gets you to focus inward, or moving your foot, or blinking your eyes, whatever it might be for you, that's our goal. Yes, sir?
So does the breathing make you focus on the present?
Yes. So if you're there, you can't be here. And a lot of one of the big symptoms of trauma, and it could be, I'm sorry if I'm ignoring you over here, one of the important symptoms of trauma, there's hyperarousal, which is that anxiousness, hypoarousal, which is the deadening, the depression, the constriction, which is the narrowing of our worldview, which is why I had you go through those questions if you're feeling pessimistic. But it's also what we know of as disassociation. Who here has heard that word, disassociation? I used to say that drinking Pinot Grigio was my favorite way to disassociate. It's just a way of checking out and spacing out. And to be present means to be present here, right here, in the here and now, and just being curious about what's going on, and accepting it without judgment. Any other questions? Anything about addiction or mental health? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not the expert. Tony Passione, and he's the guy there. They do wonderful work. They're really about resources for treatment and finding out what your needs are in terms of that assessment, and also making sure that you keep your career. It's not my area of expertise, but the take home for you all is there's help out there. There's help in terms of working with people who know what you do and know what's on the line, and who have your interest in maintaining that, as well as taking care of your well-being. Yes, sir?
What do you like reading?
Great question. Well, I have a long commute. I live in the city, and I commute out to Central DuPage Hospital, so I've been reading all the trauma specialists. So anyone who is interested in the science behind trauma, and most people have trauma. It's a question of continuum and how severe. So Bessel van der Kolk's work, The Body Keeps Score, is outstanding. Jack Kornfield, Dr. Dan Siegel, any of the interpersonal neurobiologists, which is Alan Shore, if you want an understanding of the importance of what happens with attachment, all of our childhood issues and why they don't seem to go away. If you want Pima Chodron, I'm sure there's people in the audience that were very familiar with mindfulness, have their own favorites, so please throw them out. Tara Brach, but Dan Siegel and Bessel van der Kolk. There's also Stephen Porges' work, for those real kind of science-oriented, nerdy, geeky, which I am. Stephen Porges actually does the polyvagal theory, which is all about not just the fight, flight, freeze, but also the social engagement system, which is this, that keeps us safe and takes us out of the trauma response. Porges, P-O-R-G-E-S. Stephen is S-T-E-P-H-E-N. I can actually forward you a bibliography. Yeah, I'm sorry that wasn't included. And there's more in there. I love the quote I said, sorry I didn't give him credit, but not why the addiction, why the pain, is Dr. Gabor Mate, who's really been a pioneer in getting us away from the moral failing of addiction to the idea that this is really, again, not why the addiction, why the pain, underpinnings of such pain that being a human in this world we can't get around. And that's obviously what compassion fatigue is about and what you're seeing. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, did everyone hear that question? How do we feel about the stigma of mental illness? Has it lessened? I think it has. I definitely know that the programs and supports that we have now are much different than when I was in high school. I think that interesting. I'll say, the question earlier about, do we think that the organizations we find ourselves, particularly in your industry, is going to change to support us taking better care of ourselves? Looking at it through that lens, I would say, no, we really haven't come very far. I mean, we really don't know what is required for people to be well if we put them in environments that just aggravate and exacerbate ill-ease. So in that way, possibly, and I feel for you folks and that's why we do these talks that are mandatory, so that you can take a look at yourself and see where you might be, and to know that there's no stigma in it. I'm going to take a moment since we have the time. I wanted to read this quote, and I thought it would just be too depressing, but I'm going to read it. Because, you bring up a great point. I think, I thought of really what is my goal here today. I mean, I knew it was a Monday, and I was the third hour, and I thought if I could, just get someone to think a little bit clearer about what their pain is and accept it, then that's a good deed. That was a good day. Or even better, we can get someone to recognize in someone else and just reach out a hand. It's amazing what reaching out a hand does. Just the question, are you okay? So this came from actually a LAP program, a lawyer's assistance program. It's anonymous, so I'll read it in its entirety. One attorney says, I think this happens to everyone, whether they admit it or not, or show it or not. It is inevitable with that kind of caseload that one will at least at times go bonkers. This wears on all of us and on some of us more than others. We see colleagues severely affected all the time. I think the practice leaves scars. Some make it better than others, obviously, but everyone suffers. And so part of removing the stigma is for all of us having some sense of responsibility to come forward, just as Dina talked about earlier, and say, I don't like what I'm seeing. I don't like the environment I'm working in, whether it's issues of harassment or issues of demands that are just not healthy and aren't aligned with really what our limits are. And in that way, possibly we can remove some stigma, but it takes a movement, and we all have a part in that. Yes, sir.
I'm a little bit not clear about the freeze part of the fight flight.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm so glad. You know, you kind of aren't sure, and I probably should have had a graph. And I say that because it was hard to know, you know, what the understanding of the audience was, and I'm so glad to provide this education. So the freeze, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight that gets us all fight, flight, or numb. That gets us all revving up to escape from the tiger or the bear. And then the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. That's where we're supposed to come down, right? What happens in trauma, and I'll get to freeze in a second, is that energy doesn't get released. And this all came from actually animals in the wild, where they would go through this shaking, and they would be able to allow themselves to release that energy, because this is all energy, and get on with their day. Us humans don't. We don't do that. We keep this stuff locked inside. The numb is really the freeze. It's that when, and you see this often in sadly people who are being raped. They go into a freeze where they play dead. You also see this in the wild, but you play dead because that's really what is keeping them safe at the moment. So it's evolved through evolution, and you see it concretely as that playing dead, but you also see it in more abstract ways like disassociation, which is when you're spaced out or you're checked out, you're apathetic. One of the big hallmarks is when you have compassion fatigue and you're losing empathy, you really become apathetic, and that's a sense of freezing. That's a sense of just going numb, going limp. Does that help? Okay. Any other questions? All right. Oh, sir, we have 20 minutes. I know you're hungry. Yes, sir.
In our profession, watching people get treated a lot, and people who have traumatic injuries, we see a lot of the use of opioids.
Yeah.
And when we get towards the end of the case, maybe there's been a long track record of use. You can see changes in your own client over time. How does your profession, and you mentioned it just briefly, how does your profession look at opioid addiction and how it ought to be treated? You know, things that you may see in your profession different from a clinical impression.
So if I understand your question, thank you for bringing up the opioid issue. And yes, opioids, chronic use of opioids is a bad idea. And we just saw in the news report that Purdue Pharma is no longer having drug reps out there. Over the last, since 2005, since I've been in the addiction field, we've really seen, an increase in opioid use and overdoses and deaths, which is tragic. The really big issue is recognizing that we really want to keep people alive. So when you mention clinically, it's understanding that sometimes medication-assisted therapy, which is Suboxone, if anyone's familiar with buprenorphine, or Vivitrol, which is an antagonist. But the point is we really are so interested in making sure that if they do relapse, they don't die. So we want to put protocols in place that ensures that if they do relapse, or they have tools that they don't have a tragic overdose. The other important thing about the opioid issue, and I hope, I don't know if I understood your question correctly, is who it's impacted. When I started in 2005, we really, we thought it was something that existed in the urban city. It doesn't. It's in our suburbs. It's young. It's white. It's aged 18 to 25. It's in our affluent communities. It's everywhere, and we all have a responsibility, particularly prescribing physicians, to curb our habits. Yes, ma'am.
So I work with them.
Yeah.
Try to get at treating doctors are prescribing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Case is going to be open. I'm seeing the opioid, it's going to go on and on and on. I'm a lawyer. How do I tell that person? Do I even have a role to play anymore in these situations? And then they're going to come to you, and where's the conversation that you might have with these treating doctors?
Yeah. and it's a slippery slope. It's a very nuanced argument. I will say, we actually at Northwestern Medicine have a professionals program, and the importance of the professional program is because people with attorneys, doctors, lawyers, dentists, they have a lot on the line in their career when in other safety-sensitive positions. I don't know if I can answer your question, but it's a good one, and we're faced with the same challenges. It's not an easy conversation. The opioid problem has been here for a long time. Now we have fentanyl and carfentanil, and it's a terribly unfortunate, dangerous, ongoing talk. And I would probably address your question the same way I did to the young woman back there, is you got to know what your boundaries are, know when to seek help, get the clinical understanding. And that's all best I can do for you right now with that question. But thank you for highlighting the problem we have. Yes, sir.
You just said, know your boundaries, you gotta seek help. Where can we send our people for help?
The question is, where can we send our people for help? That is a good question. And it
They
wasn't.
suffer horrendous injuries. They go to a doctor. The doctor realizes they're in pain and believes them and feeds them drugs, especially opioids. Where do we send our people?
Wow, yeah, and and this isn't my area of expertise, and I think primarily because they're not easy answers. You have to treat the addiction, and you have to work with the pain, and that's not always easy. We do get referrals from pain physicians, and the important piece is really the case management, to communicate back with that prescribing physician who has to manage the pain, and to have that relationship so they're not put on a regimen that can exacerbate the addiction. The other important piece is keeping in contact with any other healthcare professional involved in that patient or client's care. It's imperative that if, people doctor shop, but they also receive care for other conditions, and what you don't want to see is prescribing of a narcotic without knowing their addiction history. It's a very nuanced discussion. So these questions are all really good. Yes, Carol.
For those of us who actually work as clinicians, we often have to decide whether or not to approve or deny years of opioid treatment. Do you have any suggestions?
Put the client first, their health first. That's what my social work gut tells me. Put the health and the well-being of the client first. And consult with an expert on pain management and addiction.
You can't do that. You have to just do what they tell
Yeah.
us.
Anyone have advice for him?
So we're gonna have somebody from Northwestern Medicine Behavioral Health come back and talk to us about, in one of the medical seminars, about post-traumatic stress disorder and opioid addiction and things like that as it relates to our clients. Today's program has to be directed at these issues as it involves lawyers, so that's why we're talking about the issues that involve lawyers today. So that's part of the requirement for this program. But we're going to have somebody from Northwestern Medicine back.
Oh, great, yeah, Jim, yeah. Oh, it's Greek. It's long.
It's Jim Angelopoulos, I think is his name.
He's a PhD.
He offered to come back and speak to us about post-traumatic stress disorder and addiction issues as it relates to our clients. Today's program has to be about lawyers because of the professional responsibility. Okay? So thanks, everybody. Thank you.